Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in Legacy. Today we're looking at Death's Shadow. Death's Shadow is a blue-black tempo deck that actually plays quite similarly to Delver, using Daze, Force of Will, and Wasteland backed up by cheap, powerful threats. The main differences that are worse than Delver are: 1. While Shadow is technically a 1-drop, you can't actually cast it on turn 1 and you don't play any other cheap creatures, so the deck lacks the fastest starts from Delver or Dragon's Rage Channeler. And 2. The deck is black instead of red, meaning you miss some of red's best cards like Bolt, Pyroblast, and Meltdown. However, this is made up for by the excellent black cards, Shadow among them. Between Shadow and Murktide, the deck has more big threats that must be answered. The deck also has access to Hand Disruption and Thoughtseize and Grief. Snuff Out kills many big creatures that Bolt can't, while also paying life to grow Shadow. And the deck is better at grinding with cards like Baleful Strix and has great sideboard options like Plague Engineer and Torok. Additionally, Reanimate brings back dead Shadows and Griefs while also paying more life to grow Shadow. Shadow is also interesting in that it's the one Legacy deck that's actually interested in playing Shock lands for reasons besides budget. Although you still need to run at least one Underground Sea and the deck is still expensive, this means that it's more affordable relative to other Legacy decks and is more in line with the high end of Modern. Weaknesses. There are a number of ways to attack Shadow. First off, it has a weak mana base, playing only 1 or 0 basic lands and contains mostly islands. It can be hit by all kinds of land hate like Wasteland, Choke, Back to Basics, Blood Moon, Ruination, etc. Secondly, while it has a solo tempo game plan, it can still be outraced or outvalued by Control, Midrange, and so on. Force and Daze protect the creatures, but Shadow doesn't have an unlimited amount of them, and decks packing a lot of removal can pick them off. Shadow is quite vulnerable to certain stacks pieces, especially Chalice of the Void, and it can also be taken off Reanimate and Delve for Murktide by Graveyard Hate. Shadow wants to keep the opponent's mana output low since its role is the tempo deck, which is why Wasteland and Daze are useful, but decks that reliably achieve more mana and more land drops can get past it. Life from the Loam, Carpet of Flowers, and Veil of Summer in particular are great against Shadow. This is all to say that while Shadow is certainly very good, it can be fought on numerous axes. Tips and tricks. Brainstorm can put back cards you don't want, which can be fetched away, or to hide cards from Hand Disruption like Thoughtseize. Murktide gets more counters if additional spells are exiled from your graveyard in the future, for example, from casting a second Murktide. If you plan to cast 2 Murktides back to back, exile as few spells as possible with the first one so that each will be as large as possible. If you have more cards than you need to delve for Murktide, leave behind creatures if possible so you can reanimate them. If your opponent casts a spell and the only way for them to pay for Daze is a fetch land, you can Wasteland the fetch, and when they crack it in response, respond by casting Daze. This will put you 2 lands behind, but it can be worth it depending on how important that spell is. Like Modern, Scam, and Ephemerate decks, you can evoke Grief on turn 1 and reanimate it to hit 2 cards. While Reanimate is certainly great with your own creatures, especially Baleful Strix and Grief, don't forget that you can also bring back opposing creatures. For example, against Reanimator, you can Thoughtseize their Gristlebrand and then reanimate it. The card Death's Shadow is vulnerable to any effect that causes you to gain life. The most prominent ones are Swords to Plowshares and Solitude, but there are others like Grove of the Burnwillows from the Lands deck. If you're playing against any of those, avoid playing multiple Shadows at once since you could easily get 2-for-1'd. Anything that causes you to lose life at instant speed can grow Shadow out of range of burn spells or blockers, or get Shadow to lethal damage when your opponent wasn't expecting it. Fetch plus Shockland is the obvious one, but you can also cast Snuff Out, Surgical Extraction, or pay 1 with Force of Will sometimes. It's usually correct to shock yourself with your Shocklands even if you have nothing to cast with them in order to grow future Shadows. Understand how Death's Shadow works when damage is applied to it and you simultaneously, such as when you're attacked by multiple creatures and you block one. Damage done to you can cause Shadow's toughness to be greater than the damage marked on it, meaning it won't die. Reanimating a big creature can be a way to quickly grow Shadow out of nowhere, with Grief and Murktide draining away 4 and 7 life respectively. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Death's Shadow. Thank you to my supporters, and if you enjoy these videos, consider supporting the channel, and take care.